We need Greenland for national security and even international security.
Denmark hasn't done a good job at keeping Greenland safe.
In Greenland, hunters have a word for a sea with no ice. It's a word that strikes fear into the hearts of an entire nation. But 3,000 kilometers away, in Ottawa, another nation has been watching Greenland's crisis with a very different kind of fear. Because the man threatening to take Greenland is the same man who has called Canada the 51st state. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern. When Donald Trump first floated buying Greenland in 2019, world leaders laughed it off as a joke. Denmark's prime minister called it absurd. Trump canceled a state visit in retaliation. 5 years later, the joke became policy. By December 2024, Trump was telling the press that ownership and control of Greenland is an absolute necessity, and that the United States needs it for national security. Sound familiar? It should, because around the very same time, Trump began publicly mocking Canadian sovereignty, suggesting Canada should simply become part of the United States, and floating tariffs as economic leverage to make it happen. Two American allies, two resource-rich northern territories, two leaders, Mette Frederiksen in Denmark and Mark Carney in Canada, forced to publicly defend their nation's right to exist as an independent country against the president of their closest military ally. This is the new Arctic reality. Greenland's strategic value comes from three things: critical minerals, melting sea ice opening new shipping lanes, and its position as a military choke point between North America, Russia, and Europe. Canada's Arctic territory, the same Arctic that Russia calls their domain and that China has folded into its polar Silk Road strategy, shares every one of those same pressures. Both nations sit at the edge of a region that used to be frozen, isolated, and politically quiet. Now, it's becoming one of the most contested spaces on Earth. Both countries also sit on land Washington has wanted before. The U.S. tried to buy Greenland in the 1860s and again after World War II, offering Denmark $100 million in gold. Denmark refused. The U.S. stayed anyway, building Thule Air Base under a 1941 defense agreement that let American forces remain as long as they considered something a threat to U.S. security, a clause that, decades later, still gives Washington enormous reach over Greenlandic territory. Canada's history with American expansionism runs just as deep, from 19th century annexation rhetoric to the modern reality of a trade relationship worth over $700 billion a year, a relationship that gives Washington enormous leverage whenever it decides to use it. That leverage is exactly what changed in early 2025. Trump's tariff threats against Canadian steel, aluminum, and auto exports weren't just an economic dispute. They were a pressure test. Canadian officials watched tariff deadlines come and go, watched markets react, and watched Trump publicly muse again and again about Canada's future as a country. The same week, Trump told Greenlanders in his State of the Union address that America welcomes them in if they choose to join the United States. Canadian officials were fielding the same kind of rhetoric, questioning whether Canada even needed to exist as a separate nation. Mark Carney's response became one of the most quoted lines of his early tenure, that Canada's sovereignty is not for sale, not for negotiation, not up for debate. It echoed, almost word for word, what Greenlandic leaders were saying about their own homeland. Former Greenlandic Prime Minister Kapik Kleist put it simply: you cannot just buy a land or its people. That's against everything. Carney's diplomacy at the G7 summit showed the same instinct on a bigger stage. Calm, deliberate, careful never to hand Trump a soundbite he could use, while quietly building alliances with European leaders who were having the exact same conversation about Greenland. When a hot mic caught Trump making an offhand remark about Canadian trade leverage during the summit, it wasn't just gossip. It was a glimpse of the same transactional mindset being applied to two different countries at the same time. The parallel runs even deeper in the mineral story. 43 of the 60 minerals the U.S. government classifies as critical can be found in Greenland. Canada holds similarly vast reserves of potash, uranium, rare earths, and nickel, resources the U.S. desperately needs to compete with China's dominance over global supply chains. When China tightened export controls on rare earth elements, it didn't just spook global markets. It turned both Greenland and Canada into prizes in a resource race neither country asked to be part of. Canada's potash leverage over American agriculture is one of the few cards Ottawa actually holds in this standoff, a reminder that dependence in this relationship runs both ways. And in both cases, the rhetoric of protection masks the reality of pressure. Trump tells Greenlanders he wants to keep them safe from China and Russia's Arctic ambitions. He tells Canadians that tariffs are about fentanyl and border security. Critics on both sides of these relationships see the same thing underneath: a push for control, dressed up as concern for an ally's well-being. Danish conservative MP Rasmus Jarlov said it plainly about Greenland, and it applies just as easily north of the 49th parallel. He just wants more land. He wants to put his name on the map. Whether that map says Greenland or Canada may matter less than the logic driving the pressure in the first place. What makes this moment different from past American pressure campaigns is the audience now watching closely. European leaders, alarmed by Trump's Greenland rhetoric, have started openly questioning whether transatlantic alliances can still be trusted at all. Denmark is now buying French and Italian air defense systems instead of American ones, a quiet but unmistakable signal of where trust has shifted. Canada has made similar moves of its own, diversifying trade partnerships and defense procurement, and leaning harder into relationships with Europe and the Indo-Pacific rather than relying entirely on Washington. Both nations are learning the same lesson at the same time from the same source: that being an ally does not guarantee your borders, your resources, or your sovereignty are safe from your closest friend. Greenland's independence movement and Canada's sovereignty fight are, on paper, completely separate political stories. But Trump's Arctic ambitions have accidentally linked their fates, turning two proud, resource-rich northern nations into test cases for the same question. In this new era of great power politics, does the size of your population determine whether your sovereignty is even up for discussion? Greenland has 57,000 people. Canada has 40 million. The scale is different. But the pressure campaign feels eerily, uncomfortably the same. The Arctic is melting, and with it, so is the old assumption that borders between allies are permanent.